What would you do if the only thing your father left you was a piece of paper everyone was willing to kill for? If that single, worn map was not a guide to a fortune in gold, but to a truth so dangerous it had already cost him his life, and now threatened to take yours? For Claire Whitcomb, a young woman left for dead in the blistering Arizona sun of 1880, this was not a question. It was the dust in her throat, the blood on her hands, the one thing she had left to hold on to. The men who had shared her fire and her journey had turned on her for that map, believing it led to Spanish silver. But the truth waiting in the silence of the canyons was something far older, far heavier, and infinitely more valuable. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of survival, justice, and the secrets buried in stone. The sun was a hammer, and the desert was its anvil. Claire Whitcomb felt herself being forged into something brittle and thin, ready to shatter. Every breath was a sip of fire. Her lips were cracked, her vision swimming at the edges with a darkness that felt like a cool relief she knew she must not accept. Just yesterday, there had been 4 of them. 4 souls heading west, a small company against the vast indifference of the territory. There was Miller, the fast-talking guide, and the 2 brothers, Jeb and Cole, whose silence she had mistaken for simple-mindedness. They had been her companions for 3 weeks, ever since she'd left the last dusty outpost with her father's leather satchel and the mule she'd bought with the last of her money. A memory flared, hot and sharp as the sun itself. The campfire last night, Miller's eyes glinting as he looked at her satchel. "That map your pa left you," he'd said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "Must lead to something special. A man like him, chasing stories his whole life." She had clutched the bag tighter. "It's just family history," she'd lied. The lie had been thin, and they had seen right through it. They saw the ghost of obsession, and where there was obsession, they smelled gold. The real memory was of the morning, the sudden violence. Jeb holding her arms while Cole tore the satchel from her grasp. Miller's fist striking her cheek, the world exploding in a flash of white pain. They had ripped the bag open, pulling out her father's journals, his sketches, and the map itself, unfolding it with greedy, grimy fingers. But Claire had been clever. The map they held was a decoy, a copy of a territorial survey she'd made herself. The real one, the one her father had pressed into her hand on his deathbed, was sewn into the hem of her skirt. When they found nothing but familiar lines on the paper, their rage had turned ugly. They took the mule, the water, the last of the hardtack. They took everything but the clothes on her back and the secret stitched into them. They had left her to the sun and the vultures, their laughter scraping against the silence as they rode away. Now she was staggering toward a fissure in the towering red rock walls of a canyon, the only promise of shade for miles. Each step was a negotiation with oblivion. Her father's last words echoed in the ringing of her ears, a feverish whisper. "The names, Claire. The names are the treasure, not the silver." It had made no sense then, and it made less sense now. All she wanted was a sip of water, a moment out of the relentless glare. The canyon beckoned, its shadows deep and cool. It felt like a tomb, but even a tomb was better than this burning, open grave. With the last of her strength, she stumbled over the lip of a dry wash and into the blessed twilight of the stone. She followed the winding path of the canyon, her bare feet raw on the hot stone and gravel. The shade was a mercy, but the air was still and close, thick with the dry scent of dust and ancient heat. The walls rose on either side, sheer cliffs of sandstone layered in rust and ochre, carved by millennia of wind and water that were now only a distant memory. Hope was a dying ember, and she knew it. Without water, shade was only a postponement of the inevitable. She pressed on, driven by a primal instinct that had little to do with thought. Her body moved, but her mind was a haze of grief and pain. She thought of her father, a gentle man with ink-stained fingers and an insatiable curiosity for the past. He had been a historian, a collector of forgotten stories. This map was his final obsession, the culmination of years spent poring over territorial archives and whispered legends. He'd believed it led to the truth behind the founding of the territory's most prosperous town, redemption. A truth, he'd claimed, that was built on a crime. Now he was gone, and she was the sole inheritor of his dangerous quest. It was then that she saw it. Not a cave, not a natural shelter, but something that was wrong. Amidst the chaotic, organic tumble of a massive rockfall at the canyon's end, there was a line, a perfectly straight, vertical line where nature would have made a curve or a crack. It was a shadow, thin as a knife's edge. Her heart, a slow and tired drum, beat a little faster. She scrambled closer, her hands finding purchase on the rough rock. The line was the edge of a massive slab of stone, set so perfectly against the cliff face that it was almost invisible. Near the bottom, wedged into a crevice, was a piece of wood, gray and weathered as bone. Her breath caught. On the wood was a carving, faded but unmistakable, a circle with a cross through it. The same symbol marked the terminus of her father's map. This was it. This was the place. There was no handle, no knob, no visible hinge. It was a seal, not a door. Desperation gave her a surge of frantic energy. She grabbed a heavy, sharp-edged stone from the scree slope and began to pry at the edge of the wooden wedge. The wood was brittle, petrified by decades of dry heat. It splintered, then cracked. With a final, groaning heave, she levered it out. A puff of stale, musty air sighed from the crack, a breath held for a century. The great stone slab shifted, scraping inward just an inch. It was enough. She squeezed through the opening, into the cool, absolute darkness beyond, and collapsed onto a floor of packed earth, the world finally, mercifully, going black. What was this place her father had sent her to? A dusty grave in the middle of nowhere? What secret could possibly be worth dying for? And what would you do to protect it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more tales from the untamed frontier. Now, as Claire lay unconscious in the dark, another presence was making its way into the canyon, a man who followed the tracks of thieves, unaware they would lead him to the keeper of a forgotten history. Deputy Samuel Pike was a man who preferred the company of horses and the clarity of the horizon. He read the land like other men read books, and the story it told him now was a grim one. 3 sets of shod horses and 1 unshod mule heading east. A single set of smaller, scuffed boot prints staggering west into Diablo Canyon. He'd been tracking Miller's party for 2 days, ever since they'd been reported for cheating a freighter out of his pay. But the tracks told a new story now, one of robbery and abandonment. He dismounted at the canyon mouth, his old gray gelding, Dust, letting out a low sigh. Pike ran a hand over the horse's neck, his eyes scanning the ground. The girl's tracks were faltering, the steps growing shorter, less certain. She was hurt, or exhausted, or both. He drew his colt, the familiar weight a comfort in his hand, and proceeded on foot, his movements deliberate and quiet. He was a lawman, but out here, the law was often just the man who was more patient, more observant, and quicker on the draw. He found her just inside the opening in the rock face, a dark slit that smelled of dust and time. She was curled on the ground, a small, still heap in the gloom. Her face was bruised and sunburned, her clothes torn. For a moment, he thought he was too late. He knelt, his fingers finding the faint, thready pulse in her neck. Alive. Just. He saw the empty, discarded satchel lying near the canyon entrance and pieced the story together. Miller had taken everything and left her for dead. Pike's jaw tightened. He had little tolerance for men who preyed on the weak. He gently lifted her, carrying her deeper into the shelter, away from the sliver of deadly sunlight at the entrance. He laid her down and used the last of the water in his own canteen to wet his bandana, dabbing at her cracked lips and feverish forehead. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were wide and filled with a terror that slowly faded into confusion. "You're safe," he said, his voice a low rumble, unused to softness. "Name's Pike. Deputy." Her eyes darted around the dark space, then fixed on him, wary and assessing. She tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness forcing her back down. They took everything," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Miller, the brothers." "I know," Pike said, his gaze clinical. "I've been tracking them." He saw her as a victim, another piece of collateral damage in the brutal calculus of the frontier. A girl who had trusted the wrong people, who had likely been lured by tales of easy fortune. "Treasure maps get people killed, miss," he said, his tone flat. Not unkindly, but weary with a truth he'd seen proven too many times. "Looks like you learned that the hard way." Claire flinched at the word map. Her hand instinctively went to the hem of her skirt, a gesture so small Pike almost missed it. But he didn't. His eyes narrowed slightly. There was more to this story. As her strength slowly returned, she thought of her father's final, cryptic warning, the words he had spoken as he gave her the real map. "The names are the treasure, Claire, not the silver." Looking at the deputy's stoic, suspicious face, she knew he would see the same thing Miller had, a fool's errand. He saw a girl clutching a fantasy. He couldn't yet see she was clutching a legacy. The real mockery wasn't in his words, but in his dismissal of a truth he couldn't yet comprehend. By nightfall, Claire was able to sit up and sip the water Pike had given her. He had built a small, smokeless fire just inside the entrance, its flickering light pushing back the immense, ancient darkness of the chamber. It wasn't a cave. As her eyes adjusted, she could see the clean, deliberate lines of the walls. This place had been dug, carved from the living rock by human hands. It was a hideout. Pike returned from a patrol of the canyon's entrance, his silhouette filling the narrow opening for a moment before he stepped inside. "No sign of them," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the stone room. "They're long gone, for now." He didn't ask about the map again, for which Claire was grateful. Instead, he unpacked a few meager supplies from his saddlebag: coffee, a strip of jerky, a handful of dried beans. It was the plainest meal she had ever seen, and it looked like a feast. While he prepared the food, Claire took his lantern and pushed herself to her feet, her legs still unsteady. She began to explore. The main chamber was large, with a high ceiling that disappeared into shadow. To the back, two smaller rooms had been hewn from the rock. In one, she found rotting wooden bunks stacked 3 high. In the other, barrels were lined against the wall. She tapped one. It was full. She found the bung and worked it loose. The smell was stale, but it was unmistakably water. A deep well had been dug in the corner of the room, fitted with a rust-seized hand pump. This place hadn't just been a temporary shelter. It was built to withstand a siege. There were crates of what looked like hardtack, sealed with wax that had cracked and yellowed with age. There were rifles stacked in a corner, coated in a thick layer of hardened grease for preservation. It was a time capsule, a perfectly preserved outlaw den. Pike watched her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He saw the wonder in her eyes, the way she touched the cold stone walls with a strange reverence. To him, it was just a hole in the ground, a relic of a violent past. It was a curiosity, but his mind was on the present, on the living, breathing criminals he was sworn to catch. He was a man of tangible things: warrants, tracks, the cold iron of the law. This place was a ghost story. "Don't get too attached," he advised, stirring the beans in a small tin pot. "Soon as you're able, I'm taking you to Redemption. You can file a report with the sheriff." The thought of redemption sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool of the rock. Her father had warned her about redemption. He had said the town's foundations were rotten. For now, this dusty tomb felt like the only safe place in the world. As they ate their silent meal, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, Claire felt a profound sense of arrival. It was a disappointment, yes. There were no glittering chests of Spanish silver. But there was water. There was shelter. There was a fortress against the men who wanted her dead, and the desert that was happy to oblige. It wasn't the treasure she had expected, but it was the one she desperately needed. The next day, a fragile strength began to return to Claire's limbs. The water from the well boiled and cooled, tasted of stone and time, but it was life. While Pike was outside, tending to his horse and scouting the upper ridges of the canyon, she continued her methodical exploration of the hideout. She was driven by more than simple curiosity now. This place was a part of her father's story, the last chapter he never had the chance to write. She felt a duty to read its secrets, to understand what had drawn him to this desolate spot. She moved into the deepest chamber, a small cell-like room that seemed to have been a place for storage or perhaps for a solitary leader. The air here was even more still, the silence more profound. She ran her hand along the wall, the stone cool and smooth against her palm. And then her fingers snagged. It wasn't a natural ridge or a flaw in the rock. It was a line, precise and intentional. She held the lantern closer, its yellow light chasing away the shadows. Letters, carved deep into the sandstone. J. Hale. The carving was not the crude scratching of a bored cowboy. The serifs were deliberate, the lines confident. It was a signature. Below it, another name, T. Cormac, and a third, slightly apart from the others, S. Blackwood. The names hung there in the silent air, ghosts given form. Pike would see them as nothing more than the roll call of long-dead thieves, a historical footnote. But for Claire, it was a thunderclap. Her hands trembled as she fumbled in the pocket of her dress, retrieving the small, tightly folded piece of oilcloth that held her father's true map. She unfolded it carefully. On the front were the topographical lines leading to this very canyon. But it was the back that mattered. In her father's faint, scholarly pencil script, he had transcribed a list of names he'd found in an old territorial ledger. At the top of the list were the same three names she was now staring at on the wall: J. Hale, T. Cormac, S. Blackwood. The connection was electric, a spark jumping across a gap of 90 years. Her father hadn't been mapping a location. He had been mapping a conspiracy. The hideout wasn't the destination. It was the key, the physical proof that linked a forgotten crime to the present day. This place was the origin. When Pike returned, She showed him the names on the wall. He squinted at them, his expression unchanged. "Names of the men who built this place, I reckon," he said, shrugging. "Long dead." "Look," she said, her voice shaking with the force of her discovery. She showed him the back of the map. He took it, his gaze moving from the paper to the wall and back again. For the first time, a flicker of something other than weary duty crossed his face. It was interest. "Your father wrote these?" he asked. "He was a historian," she replied. "He believed these men didn't just disappear. He believed they founded the town of redemption." Pike was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling in the small, carved room. He was still a lawman looking at a cold case, but the pieces were starting to fit together in a way that pointed not to the past, but to a living, breathing lie. The silence in the hideout no longer felt empty. It felt watchful, waiting to have its story told. A partnership of necessity was forged in the days that followed. The hideout became their world, a small island of order in the vast wilderness. The labor was hard, but it was grounding. It was a way of pushing back against the chaos that had nearly consumed Claire. She took charge of the domestic sphere of their strange new home. She swept the packed earth floors with a makeshift broom of dried brush, the rhythmic scraping a comfort in the silence. She inventoried the supplies, finding barrels of flour, beans, and salted meat, all miraculously preserved in the dry, stable air. She worked the rust from the old well pump, her hands raw and aching, until with a final, groaning shriek, it began to draw up cool, clear water. Each small victory was a reclamation of her own agency. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a steward of this place. Pike, for his part, focused on security. He cleared the rockfall from the main entrance, creating a narrow, defensible passage that could be blocked in an instant. He spent his days scouting the canyon, learning its every twist and turn, every lookout point and hidden passage. He was a silent, watchful presence, his vigilance a protective mantle over their sanctuary. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but companionable. He would clean his rifle, and she would mend the tears in her dress with a needle and thread she'd found in a forgotten supply box. Their silent companion was Dust, the old gray gelding, who would stand just outside the entrance, his patient silhouette framed against the star-dusted sky. Claire often found herself talking to the horse when Pike was away on patrol, her voice soft as she recounted the day's small accomplishments. The animal would watch her with liquid brown eyes, occasionally flicking an ear as if in understanding. Caring for the horse, watering him, checking his hooves for stones, became a ritual that connected her to the simple, life-affirming rhythms of a world she had almost been lost to. As Claire worked, the hideout continued to give up its secrets. While clearing debris from under a rotten bunk, her fingers brushed against the corner of something hard and flat. She pulled it out. It was a ledger, its leather cover cracked and stiff. The pages were filled with elegant, spidery script, detailing transactions. But it wasn't a record of sales. It was a meticulous accounting of theft. Wagons waylaid, payrolls stolen, shipments of goods diverted, and more. Tucked between the pages were legal documents, land grants, mining claims, deeds to properties, all signed over under duress, the signatures shaky and forced. The names Hale, Cormac, and Blackwood appeared again and again, signing off on the division of the spoils. It was the founding charter of a criminal enterprise. Pike studied the ledger that night, his face grim in the firelight. He was a man of the law, and this book was a testament to its utter violation. He ran a thumb over the names. "These are the founding families of redemption," he said, his voice quiet. "Judge Hale, Marcus Cormack, owns the biggest ranch in the territory, and Silas Blackwood runs the bank." He looked at Claire, and for the first time, he saw her not as a girl in trouble, but as the inheritor of a righteous and dangerous truth. The map hadn't led her astray. It had led her to the bedrock of a crime that had never been solved, only buried. The final piece of the puzzle lay hidden in a small, rust-pocked ammunition box Claire found tucked away on a high shelf. It was locked. Pike, with a grunt of effort, managed to pry the lid open with the tip of his hunting knife. The box was not filled with cartridges. Instead, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth and a small, tarnished silver locket. Claire carefully untied the oilcloth. The letters were brittle, the ink faded to a pale brown. They were written by the outlaws, Hale, Cormack, and Blackwood, to their families back east. They were filled with boasts of their new prosperity, their cleverness in a lawless land. One letter from the man who called himself Hale was chillingly direct. "We have acquired enough capital and land to begin the second phase of our enterprise," he wrote. "We shall build a town, a beacon of civility. We will be its founders, its law, its bank. The past will be buried, and our new names will be spoken with respect. Our fortunes are made, and our children will never know the crude necessities of their making." It was a confession and a business plan, all in one. The town of redemption was not just built on crime. It was the purpose of the crime. Claire felt a profound, sorrowful weight settle over her. This was the truth her father had died for. He had been piecing together this story, and the descendants of these men had silenced him before he could reveal it. Pike read the letters over her shoulder, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. He was a deputy sworn to uphold the laws of the territory, and he had just discovered that the very pillars of that territory, the judge, the rancher, the banker, were descendants of the men who had written its laws in blood and ink for their own profit. Claire picked up the small locket. She clicked it open. Inside was a tiny, faded daguerreotype of a woman with a severe expression, holding a small, solemn-faced boy. On the back, scratched into the soft silver with the tip of a pin, were the words, "For my son, Jedediah Hale. May he never know his father's true trade." This was Jedediah Hale I, the current Judge Hale's grandfather. The boy who was raised on stolen wealth, who grew up to become the arbiter of justice in a town founded on injustice. In that moment, Claire's grief for her father transformed. It was no longer a passive sorrow, but an active resolve. His quest was now her own. She looked at Pike, whose own sense of duty was undergoing a profound and seismic shift. They were no longer just two people hiding from a common enemy. They were partners, guardians of a truth that had the power to unmake the world they knew. The air in the hideout was thick with the presence of the past, not as ghosts, but as a living debt that demanded to be paid. They now held the proof, the story in its entirety. The only question was whether they would live long enough to tell it. The sky had been a searing, cloudless blue for days, but a change was coming. A bruised purple began to stain the western horizon, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain and ozone. A desert monsoon was brewing. The storm was not the only threat gathering. Pike, from his lookout high on the canyon rim, saw them first. 3 riders moving slowly, methodically, searching the network of canyons. It was Miller, Jeb, and Cole. They hadn't given up. Miller, now calling himself Finch, a name he'd used before, was obsessed with the idea that Claire had outsmarted him, that the real map led to a hoard of Spanish silver he was determined to claim. "Get inside," Pike said, his voice low and urgent as he slid back down the rock face to the hideout. "Block the entrance." They worked quickly, rolling heavy stones into the narrow passage until it was sealed tight, leaving only a few small, defensible gaps. The hideout, once a sanctuary, had become a fortress under siege. The first crack of a rifle echoed through the canyon, the bullet whining off the rock far above their heads. Finch and his men had found them. The storm broke then, the heavens opening with a furious deluge. Rain came down in solid sheets, turning the dry wash into a raging brown torrent. Thunder cracked like the sky splitting apart, and lightning lit the canyon in stark, epileptic flashes. The siege began in earnest. Bullets spanged against their stone barricade. Pike returned fire with one of the old, heavy sharps rifles from the hideout, its powerful report a deep bass note against the storm's fury. The gun was heavy and unfamiliar in Claire's hands, but she loaded a second one, her movements sure and steady. The victim who had staggered into this canyon a week ago was gone. In her place was a woman forged in fire and grief, a woman with a purpose as hard and clear as the stone that sheltered her. Hours passed. The storm raged, and the gunfire was sporadic. During a lull, Pike risked a look through a firing slit. A ricochet sent stone chips flying, and he cried out, clutching his arm. A bullet had grazed his bicep, tearing a bloody furrow through the muscle. The injury wasn't fatal, but it was deep, and he was losing blood. Claire pulled him back, her face set. She tore a strip from her petticoat and, using the raw whiskey from a flask in Pike's saddlebag, cleaned and bandaged the wound as he gritted his teeth against the pain. He was weakened, and the responsibility shifted to her. It was her fight now, more than ever. She took up the watch, her eyes scanning the storm-lashed canyon. She remembered a secondary fissure they had found at the back of the hideout, a narrow chimney leading to a small ledge high on the cliff face. It was a risk, but it offered a different angle. She chose to take it. The crisis had come, and she had chosen to commit, not just to her own survival, but to the defense of the truth her father had died for. During a flash of lightning, she saw one of Finch's men, the younger brother, Cole, pinned down by a small rock slide, his leg trapped. Finch and Jeb had abandoned him. He was shouting, but his cries were lost in the storm. An enemy, yes, but also just a boy, terrified and alone. In that moment, Claire made another choice, one that would define her completely. When the storm finally broke at dawn, the canyon was a changed world. The air was clean and cool, the red rock gleaming wetly in the new light. The torrent in the wash had subsided to a muddy trickle. There was no sign of Finch or Jeb. They had fled in the night, their greed finally overcome by the storm and the stubborn defense of the hideout. The siege was over. Pike was weak but stable, his arm tightly bandaged. Under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom, Claire had carried out her plan. She had slipped out the back fissure, climbed to the ledge, and made her way down to the trapped boy, Cole. He had been terrified, expecting a bullet, but she had offered him water, and with Pike's grudging help, they had managed to free his leg. It was broken, but he was alive. They brought him into the hideout, an act of mercy that sealed their moral victory. The boy, delirious with pain and gratitude, told them everything. He confirmed Finch's obsession with the mythical silver and his willingness to kill for it. He would be their witness. A week later, Pike was strong enough to ride. He and Claire left the canyon, taking Cole with them, his legs splinted and bound. They rode not to the nearby town of Redemption, but south, towards the territorial capital in Prescott. Pike knew the local sheriff in Redemption was a man firmly in banker Blackwood's pocket. Justice would not be found there. He sent a telegram ahead to the U.S. Marshal's office, a brief, coded message requesting a meeting on a matter of territorial security. The Marshal, a man named Elias Thorne, was the kind of professional legends were written about. Quiet, methodical, and incorruptible. He met them in a dusty office, his calm gray eyes taking in Pike's sling, Claire's resolute expression, and the pile of evidence they placed on his desk, the outlaw ledger, the bundle of letters, and her father's map. Claire told the story, her voice clear and steady. She spoke of her father's research, of the attack in the desert, of the hideout and its secrets. Thorne listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. When she was finished, he spent an hour examining the documents, his fingers tracing the faded script of the ledger, comparing the signatures to territorial bank records he had sent for. Finally, he looked up. "The signatures in this ledger," he said, his voice even, "are a perfect match for the founding signatures on the Redemption Town Charter and the incorporation documents for the Blackwood Bank." It was quiet, definitive vindication. The chorus of whispers that had followed the Whitcomb name for years, the eccentric historian and his strange daughter, was about to be silenced for good. The next day, Marshal Thorne and a detachment of deputies rode into Redemption. There was no spectacle. Judge Hale was arrested in his chambers, Marcus Cormack on the porch of his sprawling ranch house, and Silas Blackwood behind the polished bars of his own bank. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as the foundations of their world were quietly and irrevocably dismantled. The truth, buried for 90 years, had finally seen the light of day. Weeks later, Claire and Samuel Pike stood on the ledge outside the hideout, watching the sun dip below the canyon rim. The air was warm, and the stone around them glowed with a deep, coppery light. The hideout was no longer a dusty tomb or a fortress. They had cleaned it, organized it, and made it a place of peace. The entrance was open, letting in the evening breeze. The ghosts had been laid to rest. The lands and assets of the Hale, Cormack, and Blackwood families had been seized by the territorial government. Marshal Thorne, using the meticulous records in the outlaw ledger, was in the process of identifying and compensating the descendants of the families whose properties had been stolen nearly a century before. Justice, slow and grinding, was being done. "All that Spanish silver they were so sure was hidden here," Pike said, breaking the comfortable silence. He gestured with his good arm towards the interior, where they had indeed found a small cache of tarnished coins, now turned over to the marshal. Barely worth the trouble they caused. Claire looked away from the sunset, her gaze falling on the names carved into the stone wall just inside the entrance. J. Hale, T. Cormack, S. Blackwood. They were no longer a secret, but a monument, a lesson etched in stone. She thought of her father, of his quiet, relentless pursuit of a story no one else had believed. "My father always said the truth was the only treasure worth digging for," she murmured. Pike looked at her, his usual stoicism softened by the golden light. He reached out and gently took her hand. His touch was warm, solid. In the crucible of the canyon, under siege and in defense of a shared purpose, they had forged something rare and strong. It needed no words. They had survived. They had brought justice. And they had found in this desolate, beautiful place, not a fortune, but a future. A future to be built together, on a foundation of truth Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Old West. It is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest inheritances are not riches, but the courage to see a difficult truth through to the end. If you were moved by Claire and Samuel's story, please consider leaving a like and a comment below, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of the frontier. We'll have another story for you next week.